Well, good evening, everyone. The Center for Business and Public Policy of the McDonough School of Business here at Georgetown is honored to host the USA launch of Capitalism Without Capital, The Rise of the Intangible Economy, written by Jonathan Haskel in the middle there, Stian Westlake to my right. This book was released in Britain in early December, less than 2 months ago. And Capitalism Without Capital has already made the Financial Times and the Economist magazine's top 10 list of the best economics and business books of 2017. This book has just been issued. And you're going to see why it has garnered such critical acclaim in just a few minutes. So this book is about a subject that is not only near and dear to my heart, but those of others who work on innovation, here at the center and at this university, and indeed many in this room have worked directly or indirectly on advancing the state of knowledge in this area. I'm looking at Mike Mandel here, who wrote a cover story for Business Week 11 years ago, almost to the date, that drew attention to this subject. And it was literally not very much heard of at that time. So hats off to you. And here we are today with one of the top 10 books on the subject, making these prestigious lists. So I think we're in for a treat, and it's certainly a special treat for me. Jonathan Haskel is a professor at Imperial College, and I think he's been a co-author of mine for nearly a decade, and a good friend. And we, meaning he and I, along with Stian, who is an economic advisor at the UK's Ministry of Universities, Science, Research and Innovation. Recently we wrote an essay. It was great fun to put it together. And what was even more fun is it won a prize, which for me was one of my big events of 2017. So imagine these guys, they've got 2 big events of 2017. Well, anyway, enough of why I think what these gentlemen are doing is important, and let's just get on to the program. And the format is as follows. We will have a presentation by the authors, followed by an audience Q&A moderated by Ryan Avent. He is the free exchange columnist at the Economist magazine and a senior editor, and he will lead this discussion, I am sure, into great territory. Okay, so with that, let me turn it over to the panel on the stage, and it's up to you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all very much indeed for coming. Thank you, Carol. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. As you'll see from the slides in just a second, our work reflects an enormous amount of work which has been done by many people in this room. I'm going to talk for, I hope, 7 or 8 minutes. I'm going to then pass over to Stian, who's going to talk for also 7 or 8 minutes. We'll do a little bit of Q&A between the 3 of us, and then throw it open to the floor. So let's see if this tangible clicker works. So here the agenda really follows the book. The book's got sort of 3 bits to it. Firstly, the rise of the intangible capital. Secondly, why should we bother? After all, capital changes all the time, so why is intangible capital different? Which Stian will talk about. And then, as I say, the third thing which we'll take up in the discussion with Ryan is what does this mean for the economy and for society. So we're going to start with the rise of the intangible economy. I'm just going to say a couple of words about this. The heart of our book is an observation which we learnt from Carol's work and from Mike Mandel's article as well, which is that the nature of investment and capital assets in the economy is changing. As you can see on the screen on the left-hand side there, you can see the traditional types of capital assets which are measured by national accountants. There are many national accountants in this room who work very hard on these types of issues. Those are the traditional types of assets measured by national accountants: buildings, computers, plant machinery, vehicles, all very tangible things. And when you're brought up on this in the UK, you're told that when Keynes was inventing national income accounting in the 1940s in the UK, these are the types of assets, not computers, but these are the types of assets which he thought about. I found that when I come here, I learnt that it was actually Kuznets who invented national income accounting, you know, here here in the US in the American Bureau. But anyway, whichever way you wish. So those are the traditional types of assets. And at the core of the book is the observation that type of investment is changing very substantially, and it's changing to these intangible investments, which you can no longer touch or feel so well. So what are the intangible investments? I just want to be clear to get on the table as to what they are. So the top one is R&D. Lots of people have talked about R&D, and statistical agencies have spent lots of time attempting to incorporate this and count this better. But there are many other intangible assets, and the menu of intangible assets includes some of the following. Things like training. So if you go to, for example, to financial services and ask banks what do, they don't do any R&D to a first approximation, but they do lots of training. Design. I work at Imperial College in the UK. Rolls-Royce come to Imperial College an enormous amount. Again, if you ask what do, they do do lots of R&D. They do an enormous amount of design as well. Organizational development. What is it that makes Walmart feel different to Kmart? It's something about the nature of the organizational capital. Brands and marketing, clearly incredibly important. Artistic originals, and there's an important British innovation there, the artistic original, illustrated for you. And of course, software and data, very important in powering the kind of ICT economy. Now, that would be all, sort of straightforward, were it not for the fact that this change is quite hidden. And those of you who remember Mike Mandel's piece will remember that was the front of the piece. It had a picture of a dollar bill with somebody blindfolded on the front of it, right? That you couldn't see these types of intangibles. So let's just go through this. So the first observation is that GDP still doesn't include many of these intangibles. As we said, it includes these tangible assets have been included since the 1940s. And some, over the years, some intangible assets have been added. So in the UK, software, artistic originals was added quite a while ago. In the US, Rachel Solvejcik, who's sitting here, has added artistic originals in the US a little bit more recently. We've added R&D more recently, very recently in the UK, literally in the last couple of years. And people like Dennis Fixler and so forth have worked here on those types of issues. But the other types of intangibles that I mentioned earlier on, things like organizational development, branding, training, and all of that, that isn't counted in GDP. That said, if you think that national income accounting is sort of moving slowly, you should look at company accounting. In company accounting, basically almost nothing has happened. And there was many of you were here for a conference that Carol and I and Javi organized last year, where Baruch Lev from New York University came and talked very eloquently about essentially the absence of information in company accounts. Let me just show you, this is his graph here. Let me just walk you through this graph very quickly just so you can get some kind of idea. This graph does the following. The left-hand blue line says this. This is Baruch Lev's work. Take the companies who entered the US stock market in the 1950s and ask how much of their stock market value can be explained by their asset value. And the answer is, if I look at this, about 85%. That's an R squared from a regression. Right? And then the very far right-hand line, as you can see on the screen, says, take the companies who entered the US stock market in the 2000s and ask the same question, how much of their value can be answered? And the answer is about 25%. And Lev has argued very strongly that company accounting is almost now completely uninformative, simply because it misses out all of those types of intangibles. So that's the issue. And what our book attempts to do is it attempts to draw together the literature which has tried to include these intangibles in various ways that we describe and see what the economy looks like as a consequence. Now, you might then reasonably say, well, if all these intangibles are hidden, how do we know about them? I mean, it would be a rather short book, right, if we didn't know anything about them. So what's the story here? So the story here begins in 1962 by a book by an economist called Fritz Matschlup, who wrote a book called The Production and Distribution of Knowledge in the United States, which was really a very early book which concentrated on then, R&D, very, very early types of software programming. And Matschlup sort of documented how in the US this was becoming very important, this is very important, and said in various ways how this might be, how national accounts might be improved. He was an interesting guy. Just to break off for a second, he was, as many of his generation were, a refugee from Europe, came to the US in the 1930s, having been forced to flee Austria. And I must say, I would have liked to have been one of his students, because one of the criticisms, of course, of economics professors is they don't know anything at all about the real economy. But Matschlup, before he came over here, was an industrialist. He was a businessman, and therefore he was thrown out of Austria and all of his assets seized. And he ran the Austrian cardboard cartel in the 1920s. So he really did know about business. Anyway, so he sort of started off that literature. It took a while, but in 2001, here's a picture of Len Nakamura from the Philadelphia Fed, who wrote an article with this kind of huge title here, Investing in Intangibles is $1 trillion missing from GDP. Leonard arguing that, again, the omission of intangibles from the accounts was important. And then in 2005, we had this book here, and here are the authors. So Carol, you've already heard from. Chuck Holton, who works at the University of Maryland, and Dan Sickle, wrote a very influential article there, which I think Mike Mandel's article then picked up on, essentially bringing this together, using the list of assets, which I've just said, and bringing that to the US national accounts. And what our book does is it draws very much on that, and the joint work that I've had the pleasure of working with Carol and the others doing, and looking at this across different countries. Now, we think, of course, that once you write a book on something, you sort of see them everywhere. We think that intangibles are everywhere. An obvious example would be Uber and LinkedIn and all of those things which are on your phone. So we've tried to go for a kind of a non-technology example. An example we choose is gyms. So you all look a fit and healthy crowd, so you'll be familiar with going to the gym. So if you went to the gym in 1977, so that was Arnold Schwarzenegger's breakthrough movie, Pumping Iron, the gym looked like this, all very tangible. You see, it's in a building. You see lots of machines. If you go to the gym, as I'm sure you do more recently, what do you see? You see also the machines that people are using and the buildings, and it's all very tangible as well. But the biggest selling sort of exercise routine is by a New Zealand company called Les Mills. This is a tiny company started in the 1960s, and they now sell to literally millions of gyms all over the world, and these are routines that you do. There's music going on, and you lift weights and all that kind of thing. And it is essentially a completely intangible business. So what they do is they negotiate with the music companies a set of rights. They set that music then to a series of exercise routines which they have to design. And if you want to be an instructor standing at the front of the gym helping people do these routines, you've got to do some training. You have to submit a video and be certified and all that kind of thing. So it's a completely intangible business. As I say, from a small company in New Zealand has expanded literally all over the world. So we see intangibles everywhere as an example. Now, again, going back to the more kind of prosaic national income accounting, what happens if you put all this stuff into the national accounts and do the best you can about drawing upon other sources and seeing how many intangibles there are? You get the following type of picture. What you get in the red line is tangible investment as a proportion of GDP. This is for the EU countries plus the US and a joint international project Carol and I are involved in. And that red line shows that tangible investment is basically falling on a sort of trend. It fell particularly strongly after the Great Recession. The upward sloping blue line tells you the intangible investment, and you can see that that was rising beforehand, and indeed it's past the tangible investment around just after the recession on average in developing countries. We've got a longer picture, and this is Carrado's picture, which goes back to the 1940s here, and again shows that this broad trend of the blue line being the intangible investment rising, and passing the tangible investment to the US. So for every dollar of tangible investment, there's now much more than a dollar of intangible investment. And we think, therefore, that it's intangible capital, which is the capital of the 21st century. Why any of this matters, of course, it matters because intangible capital is different in a way. Let me pass over to Stian to take you through some of those issues.
Thank you, Jonathan. If this were just a measurement story, it would be very interesting. Measurement is important. But the point of the book is that we argue that there's even more to it than that. Capital stock changes over time. Once upon a time, we invested in canals and steam engines. Now we invest in computers and vehicles and so forth. But we believe that there is something particular about intangible capital that makes it different and that causes changes in the wider economy. And this basically boils down to unusual economic characteristics, which we think, on the whole, intangible assets tend to exhibit. And we have applied a little framework to this, which we've called the 4 S's framework. You kind of can't take the person out of business schools, or in my case, McKinsey. We like having frameworks with names. And I'd like just to talk a little bit about what these 4 S's are, and then perhaps we can talk about what that implies to some big economic questions. So the first S is scalability. Intangible assets are things that typically you can use again and again without further investment. And I'll talk about all of these in more specifics later. The second is sunkenness. Intangible assets, compared to tangible assets, tend to be quite hard to profitably dispose of if a business fails. They tend to be strongly associated with individual businesses. The third S is spillovers. If you're a business and you make an intangible investment, it's very often hard to keep the benefits of that investment to your own firm. And then the final S is synergies, which is that intangible assets, they're often ideas, they're often very good when you mix them with other intangible assets or with the labor of skilled people. So this is our 4 S's framework, which I'll just talk about now, each one in a little more detail. So if we think about scalability, taxi cabs are a great example of a not particularly scalable tangible asset. Here are some fine British taxi cabs. You can fit 5 passengers in them, but if you want to do more business, you need to buy more. You need to add to your fleet. But of course, a famous intangible intensive business is Uber. And Uber own a bunch of very valuable intangible assets, whether it's their algorithm, their software, their brand, or their kind of distributed network of drivers. And those assets are highly scalable. And as we've seen from Uber, they have rapidly scaled their software from city to city. And it requires, compared to expanding a taxi fleet, relatively little reinvestment. If we turn to sunkenness, there's a nice story here from the days back when we Europeans were good at mobile phones and cell phones. You'll recall there was a kind of little Finnish company. In fact, it almost represented the whole of the Finnish economy as far as we could see at one point, called Nokia, who made mobile phones. Things didn't go so well for Nokia, and although they're still around, they had to dispose of large parts of their business. But one thing that was quite good news for Nokia's creditors and the remainder of the business was they sold, when they got out of a big chunk of their business, they sold their fantastic Helsinki offices. And those offices realized this absolutely colossal gain. So it was a kind of it was some crumbs of comfort from the Nokia disaster. But of course, Nokia owned a bunch of other assets, more intangible assets, like the Symbian operating system. And when that was disposed, when that was taken on board by Windows, the benefit was much less significant. It was much harder to realize even a fairly well-defined intangible like an operating system, like software. And with intangibles like brands or proprietary procedures, there's potentially even less to realize in the case of business failure. The third S I mentioned is spillovers. If you have a tangible asset like a factory, it's pretty trivial to make sure that your competitors can't use the factory. You post a security guard outside the door. There are laws to prevent people breaking into your factory and using it. This is something that we've got good ways of dealing with. But if we think of an intangible asset like design, No doubt there are lots of people here who will be as wowed as I was when they first saw the iPhone, this kind of remarkable innovation. Smartphones used to be this kind of terrible junk that no one really wanted to use before 2007. And the iPhone was kind of a revelation, not just in kind of a technical R&D software point of view, but the design was amazing. But, you know, as we see, within 18 months of the iPhone being released, all smartphones started to look like the iPhone. And, you know, no laws were broken. It's just very hard to protect the idea of a particular form factor and a particular user interface, particularly when people got to using it. And, of course, from a software point of view, the Android operating system was released even sooner because, again, it's relatively hard to protect these things, even in a world where software can be patented, which I realize there are big debates about even where you can protect design rights. This stuff gets out. And then finally, I mentioned synergies. The fact that intangible ideas tend to be especially good when you combine them. Some of you will be familiar with the work of Brian Arthur, who's at the Santa Fe Institute now, who wrote a fantastic book called The Nature of Technology, where he looked from an innovation studies point of view at technology, and he argued that technologies were fundamentally combinatorial, in his words, which was that technologies were the results of merging other technologies. And we think that's true with intangibles more generally. And I've got a little example here, a kind of somewhat controversial example, because many of you will have followed the debates about the EpiPen and why the EpiPen is kind of such a profitable business. So EpiPen made over $1 billion in profits for Mylan, its manufacturers. In 2015, it probably is making even more money now. And we would argue that one of the things that makes EpiPen such a valuable property is it brings together a number of intangibles in valuable ways. EpiPen, the epinephrine, is a pharmaceutical, and you might think that some of this value was instantiated in the R&D intangible, which, how do you actually synthesize this stuff? But it turns out that the patents for making epinephrine, this is long out of patent. The patent, I think, is from 1910. So this isn't a kind of classic drug company story of a valuable patent. It's the combination of various other things that make this such a valuable franchise. So first of all, there is the design of the EpiPen. It's something that's familiar to people who use EpiPens. It's something that kind of works pretty well. But again, the design itself, there are rival designs to EpiPens, which are kind of probably as good or maybe even better. But there's a brand, and the EpiPen brand is pretty significant because it's something that people ask for, they demand in an emergency. You need to be understood. You need to be able to get it. So this kind of incredibly valuable brand is unusually important for something like the EpiPen. There's similarly a lot of kind of go-to-market intangibles that are important here. There is the distribution of EpiPens into public institutions. No doubt here there are probably EpiPens around in dispensaries. And I think in the UK, and I believe also in the US, there have been quite a lot of legal innovations to make sure that EpiPens can be distributed. In the UK, there was an amendment last year to the Medicines Act so that EpiPens could be prescribed in a kind of generic sense to institutions, which is certainly something valuable, something specific to the EpiPen, which combined with the assets makes it more valuable. And then finally, another intangible, training. You can go on EpiPen-specific training courses, which are kind of a health and safety requirement for a lot of institutions. And those things all combined have created something of a defensive moat for EpiPen, which even though there is no unique right to synthesize epinephrine, anyone can do that, that's off patent, and even though people have come up with rival designs, it's pretty hard to compete with this company, and that means that these combined intangibles are unusually valuable. Now, all of this, we believe, has pretty significant consequences for the economy and society if, as Jonathan said, intangibles are forming a greater and greater part of the capital stock. And we're going to talk a little bit about this in discussion. But in the book, we talk about a number of questions which we think that the rise of intangibles helps to answer. We think it casts some light on issues of secular stagnation, why productivity growth and investment seem to be low despite low interest rates and high corporate profits. We think it answers some questions about why it's perceived that the financial system is doing a poor job in financing the so-called real economy. We think it has some interesting answers to why inequality has risen in the past few decades. And perhaps most controversially, we think it helps cast light on why there is perceived to be a growing gulf between left-behind regions, left-behind populations, and kind of liberal elites, which has contributed to the rise of populism and a lot of the issues that we see in the US, the UK, and other countries. So the story there in three parts. There's this big change in the economy, which we've tried to present some of the work that's gone into measuring it. We think this change in the economy, this change in the capital stock is important because these intangible assets work differently from an economic point of view. And finally, we think that that helps explain various puzzles and problems in the economy today. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Ryan, who is going to kick us off with some questions.
Well, thank you, Stian. Thank you, Jonathan, for that overview. Thank you all for writing an excellent book. And if you all haven't had a chance to buy and read the book yet, I strongly encourage you to do that. It's an excellent treatment of what I think is a really important topic. It's important understanding how the economy is working these days. And we're going to get to all the different sort of effects that this kind of way of thinking can speak to. But to start off with, I want to ask you about the title. The book is called Capitalism Without Capital. But you guys are not actually saying that there's no capital playing an essential role in the economy anymore. It's just that it's intangible capital. But I'm wondering if in fact the differences between the old sort of tangible capital and intangible capital are not significant enough that we really shouldn't consider this to be something separate. If you were to talk to political economists in the 19th century, they would have said land is hugely important to understanding the economy. We don't think that now. Should we not just sort of consider tangible capital as this old sort of thing that's becoming ever less important, and intangible capital something fundamentally different?
I guess, Ron, what's tricky about all of this is that the word capital is a really kind of hard word, or rather more accurately, again, there are lots of national income accountants and careful measurement people in the audience who think they know what sort of capital means, but lots of people in the population, when you ask them about capital, people think of lots of different things. So, for example, if you ask lots of business people, they'll talk about working capital, which often means cash. If you ask people, if you go to Marx, who's the first one to talk about capital and capitalism in that kind of popularized kind of way, some capital is machines, some of it is labor, some is a stock, some is a flow. So it's a very hard concept. So I think what we try to stick to, and we try to spend quite a lot of time unpacking in the book, is the idea that what capital is a capital asset for a firm, more accurately, is it's something which provides an enduring benefit to the firm. So a machine or a piece of land gives an enduring benefit to the firm, but equally, as Stian was saying, the kind of group of intangibles around the EpiPen are giving an incredibly enduring benefits to the firm. The branding that's being done and the reputation and the money that's invested in the R&D and all that kind of thing. So we use capital in that way, something which provides an enduring asset for the firm, and that, as I say, could be tangible, it could be intangible.
Okay. Now, when you sort of think about the four S's that you've laid out here, and you think about how they relate to the industrial structure of the economy now, which, as a lot of people pointed out, is becoming more concentrated, less competitive in a lot of ways. It seems to me that some of the S's point in one direction, while some of the S's point in a different one. So the scalability and the synergies really suggest that you're going to have a highly concentrated economy in terms of the industrial structure. Whereas the spillovers bit suggests that it's actually quite easy to learn from others and that you have to have a much more competitive economy. What's the right way to think about how these factors interact to lead to oligopoly or a much more competitive sort of market?
So I think that's a really good question, and they do kind of break in slightly different directions. I think the dominant factor that we see in the rise of kind of leader firms and the growing gap between leader and laggard firms that a lot of people have talked about is very much driven by scalability of intangibles and the synergies between them. So if you're a firm, Google is a classic firm that has vast numbers of extremely valuable intangibles. Not only are those intangibles particularly valuable to them because they're a big firm with the scale and because they can combine them for synergies, but the marginal benefit to each, or to the benefit to each marginal investment in intangibles goes up because they've got this kind of installed base, as it were, to achieve synergies with. Now, the spillovers, I think, kind of can work both ways. On the one hand, as you say, ideas can get away from big firms like Google and benefit insurgents. However, one of the things we explore in the book is that the ability to take advantage of spillovers is not evenly distributed. So, and it's interesting, if you talk to management studies people or consultants, they will often talk about this kind of art or craft of so-called open innovation. And open innovation is always made out to be this kind of rather noble discipline because openness is a good thing and so forth. But another way of looking at open innovation, it's the ability to appropriate the benefits of other people's ideas and other people's spillovers. And if you look at some of these leader firms like Google, they're pretty good at doing that, whether by acquisition or often by kind of discrete or indiscrete copying. So while I think spillovers does potentially give us an opportunity for dynamism or more rivalry in the economy, which is a great remedy to these kind of the emergence of these leader firms, it also can be an advantage for the big incumbents too.
Well, it certainly seems like the big incumbents have been doing quite well over the last few decades. And in your book, you point to some of the research that shows how frontier firms, how incredibly successful firms have been pulling away from the rest of the economy. How does your story about intangible capital sort of play into that widening of the gap between leading firms and the rest? And then maybe can you link that back to the macro side of things where we're not seeing the kind of growth and productivity that we'd want to see?
Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what we were previously saying, that there were these sort of conflicting forces, and the firms who are employing a lot of these intangibles can scale up to the extent that they have all these synergies, they can bring all this stuff together, and then they're going to break away from the rest of the pack. It's going to be very difficult for the laggards to catch up. And in the book, we cite a lot of work which has been done by the OECD, who've documented this sort of widening gap in both manufacturing and services, between the leading firms and the laggard firms. And a lot of people have said, oh, my goodness me, there's something going wrong with competition policy, for example. The competition regulators are, asleep on the job. They're not restraining these, these firms who are getting big and getting dominant and all that kind of thing. And our view is to the contrary, that to the extent that these firms are exploiting all of these intangibles, it's a natural outcome of the sort of scaling up and the synergies which come from intangibles. How that then translates to the macro, the sort of second part of your question, Ron, how that translates to the macro issues about productivity and all of that. I mean, I think what it is, many people in the room might have had this experience. There's a lot of discussion in the newspapers about secular stagnation and slowing productivity. When you go to a conference with many firms and you tell them about secular stagnation and slowing productivity and show them the graphs that, the economics bureaus and so forth have, very carefully put together, if the firms sitting in the room are frontier firms, they look at you like you're mad. They want to know, they just can't understand it. Especially, go to the West Coast, talk to the Googles and the LinkedIn, talk to Uber who are scaling this thing up all the time. They just don't understand what the notion of secular stagnation is. So if what's going on is there's a mix of two different types of firms, some of whom are scaling up and doing well and the others who are the laggards, and the overall average may be, being pulled down by these lagging firms as well. So we have to bottom this out by exactly getting some complicated, micro data and looking at the different types of firms. But I think that might account for some of the macro effects, and it might account for some of the disjoint in the discussion that one often has about this.
I mean, it raises an interesting question, though, which is why don't these dynamic firms with all this intangible capital essentially displace all the laggards? Is that something you guys can explain?
So this is something that we thought a lot about, because you could sort of say, well, surely there is an equilibrium here where the large firms just kind of expand and fill all the space, and that solves your problem. And I guess what we looked at, and when we looked on a kind of case-by-case basis, we've not done this kind of in an empirical way across the economy, is we know that it does take even pretty ambitious frontier firms quite some time to exploit these benefits of synergies, just because there's only so much they can sort of bite off and chew at one time. So if we think of Amazon as a classic firm it's a kind of category killer in every category it goes into, it's extremely ambitious and it's moved on a very long way from books. Even there, it's kind of done it incrementally. We've seen in the last few days, I guess, the stories about it just sort of opening grocery stores. but it kind of expands gradually from category to category. So it may just be that the amount of friction inherent in the ability of these leader firms to scale up means that you don't get to your kind of ideal solution where the productivity is high because they kind of rapidly displace the laggard firms. Maybe there's just too much grit in the machine for that to happen immediately.
Can we talk about that friction a little bit more? Because when you think about tangible capital, we have a kind of a clear idea of like what that process of generating capital looks like. You go out, you raise some financing, then you obtain land and build a building on it and fill it with machines. What does the process of investing in intangible capital look like if you're a firm? What does it do?
So it's a really interesting question because a lot of it, I mean, there are some things that are very specialized functions. So R&D is kind of women and men in white coats in labs very often. I mean, maybe more now dealing with computers than with test tubes, but there's kind of a practice of a lot of research which is fixed. And the same with some design, for example, at least product design is often done by designers who have a practice. But a lot of investment in intangibles looks like what I would just describe as business people doing business people things. One thing that really was kind of haunted me all through writing this book, I don't know how many people are familiar with the work of David Graeber, the kind of Marxist anthropologist, but he wrote a book where he kind of inveighed against what he called bullshit jobs. The fact that nowadays so many people in society were doing kind of things that just looked like they shuffled paper from one side of the desk to another. And, David's interpretation of this, because, he is a kind of critical Marxist, was to say, well, this is just a sign that kind of society is a kind of bad place and neoliberalism is bad. But there's another way of looking at this, where actually kind of what these people are doing to a great extent is either forming or negotiating claims over intangible assets. And I then think of kind of Robert Reich's work on symbolic analysts. And, again, symbolic analysts, and they're kind of white-collar jobs or, jobs of people nowadays who don't wear ties, but that's a sort of a minor change. This is what this kind of looks like.
So when your boss comes in and you're just kind of goofing around, you can say, no, I'm investing in intangibles. That's right. The payoff will be there. What's that? Obviously, inequality is not just taking place across firms. It's also taking place across individuals and in other respects as well. But let's get to the individual's point first. When we look at the rise in top incomes, if we look at the growth in wealth at the very top, how does that relate to the fact that intangible capital is playing a much bigger role in the economy?
So here we draw on some of the work that was done by Matt Roglany, who looked at Piketty's book and looked at the rise in wealth inequality that Piketty documents, and found, at least on American data, that actually an enormous amount of it, in fact all of it, I think on an accounting sense, came from capital gains around house prices, which was rather different to Piketty's mechanism, because the mechanism, for those of you familiar with Piketty's book, you'll know the mechanism in Piketty's book is a sort of an accumulation mechanism, which is to say people sitting on a lot of wealth, as long as they keep saving it and they don't spend it, then the wealth compounds, and by the power of compound interest, it gets higher and higher and higher. And of course, if growth slows down, that compounds as well. But if it's slower than the compounding effect of interest, then the wealth of the top, goes away. So it was that very kind of accumulation kind of story in Piketty. Now, what Rogley looked at is he looked at house prices and found that actually it was accounted for by growth in house prices for those, whose predominant store of wealth was in housing. But then the question is, what was causing the growth in house prices? And part of our story is, of course, it's an intangible type of effect. And what's causing that? Well, one of the ways of thinking about the synergies which breed intangibles when these intangibles get together is they're probably going to take place in cities. So that's going to increase the sort of pressure of growth on cities. So we had it in the slide earlier on, Britain's most famous innovation is Harry Potter. If you think about the synergies in Harry Potter, the kind of bundle of intangible assets, it's not only the fantastic J.K. Rowling script, but it's the computer-generated stuff for the movie, which is sort of software design. It's the set designs, all the sort of Baroque-looking sets and designs and all those kind of things. Those types of synergies are probably going to take place in cities, actually, and indeed, they did in London and Edinburgh and all that kind of thing as well. So the intangible economy breeds that kind of movement towards cities. That pushes up the desirability of living in cities and thereby pushes up prices. So it's that kind of mechanism which you think accounts for some of the wealth inequality.
Plus the magic itself, which is intangible.
Exactly.
Well, it occurs to me that it's a great shame that your book was finished and went to publication before the whole HQ2 phenomenon.
Yeah.
Because when you think about Amazon making its relocation decision, and you think about the synergies involved, that certainly seems to be a huge consideration.
Yeah. Well, I think if we think about what does having an Amazon HQ in your city do for you from a public point of view? I mean, one way of looking at that is, obviously there's a kind of straightforward Keynesian effect that, workers buy coffees and buy houses and that kind of thing, and that's great. But the kind of the promise, I guess, of the HQ, which is why this bidding war has started, is that it will also provide these spillovers. Because perhaps people leave Amazon and they start businesses. In fact, having these people around brings all sorts of kind of synergies because their ideas cross-fertilize, and so forth. And I guess there is a sort of further element to this, which is that in a world which dynamic cities are more and more important because they're where these kind of synergies and spillovers happen, that it's more and more important for governments to do placemaking. Placemaking, this kind of craft of trying to create cities that people want to live in, and particularly kind of affluent symbolic analysts want to live in. You would imagine that would get more and more important in an economy where intangible assets are more and more important.
It's true, but as you think about potential, policy responses to inequality, and you think about the Amazon story, it really raises the question of whether the places that are doing well because they have high concentrations of skilled workers, in which case you might think that what we need to do is produce more skilled workers and perhaps concentrate them together. Or if it's because there's a finite number of places that restrict building, and so you have inequality resulting from high housing costs. Or is it the fact that you've got this superstar company effect? There's only one Amazon, and it can only be in one place, and the people who really, who work there are naturally going to do better. How do you separate these three different kind of stories, or rank them in terms of how they contribute to them?
So I think it's probably kind of a mixture of all these things. There is one thing I guess we have, if we're thinking about this question of, what do you do about left behind places? How do you improve the lot of people in an economy where dynamic cities are kind of increasing their advantage? I guess one part of the solution to that is saying, if you are, for example, spending public money on trying to do regional policy, it makes sense to try and develop more urban agglomerations, more successful cities, rather than to kind of spread the money like kind of peanut butter in a smooth layer across an area. And that is really challenging for policymakers because, if you are going to spend taxpayers' money on the basis of remedying local or place-based inequality, the kind of natural and the most resonant thing to do from the point of view of public perception is to spend it in the poorest place you can. But obviously, if the way of solving this problem is to try and create successful agglomerations, you kind of, if it makes sense, need to spend it not in the poorest place, but in the second poorest place that's near the poorest place, so that you can kind of create some more centres that hopefully will provide some of this kind of agglomeration magic. And that's a really hard, spending my day with policymakers, that's a really hard sell from a public perception point of view.
So you've promised to link intangible capital to President Donald Trump. Tell me how that story works. What's the link between that and the gentleman living just down the street here?
So one of the things that has existed for centuries in the US, the UK, and no doubt many other countries is kind of a more or less large cultural divide. There's always been a kind of cultural divide between the city and the countryside. Once upon a time, it was the division between the court and the countryside. The idea that kind of urban sophisticates and kind of normal, decent people have somewhat different perceptions of the world. This is not a new phenomenon. What is somewhat new, we believe, about the intangible economy is that in the intangible economy, some of the mindsets and some of the practices of what is sometimes called the liberal elite seem to be economically reinforced. So there was some really interesting work done in the UK at the time of our vote to leave the European Union, which has been compared to some extent to the US presidential election. And what political scientists found is that the part of the population that in the UK voted to leave the European Union, the kind of populist movement, was strongly, there's a psychological trait called openness to experience, which psychologists are sort of fond of measuring with psychometric tests. And it turned out that the Remain voting, the stay in the European Union voters, tended to have high openness to experience. The Leave voters tended to have low openness to experience, were kind of more into traditional values and kind of less interested in cosmopolitanism. Now, we've talked about the fact that in an intangible economy, what really delivers benefits is appropriating spillovers, bringing ideas together, being open to new ideas. So there's sort of some evidence that that's associated with openness to experience. So you're getting a world in which the change in the capital stock is bringing economic rewards to some of these qualities, like being a cosmopolitan, being a kind of symbolic analyst living in cities, that have long been associated with this cultural divide. So in a world where long-standing cultural divide is being kind of exacerbated by an economic divide and inequality, we think that kind of deepens the tensions and sets the scene for a kind of more aggressive, more strident populism that potentially lies behind some of the cultural divides of the election of Donald Trump and of Brexit. So that's kind of our story.
It's an interesting story. I want to give everyone here an opportunity to weigh in, so please get your questions ready. I'm going to ask you one more, and then we'll take some from the audience. And that is, if you are a policymaker and you want to encourage investment in a world in which intangible capital is a very big part of investment, what do you do? Does this sort of thing respond to an R&D tax credit? Does it respond to a reduction in the interest rate? What are the tools policymakers have to try to improve the investment climate?
If I can just weigh in, I guess there are a couple of things. One is around finance, which we talk about on the slide up on the screen. And the other is around the public science base, and since Stian is responsible for the public science base in the UK, why don't I say a quick word?
You should answer instead of me.
Let me say a quick word about finance. So, as you were saying earlier on in your question, Ryan, the classic way in a tangible economy that you raise finance for a new enterprise is you get a building, a load of machines, you go to a bank, ask the bank to lend you some money, and they say, where is the security? And you show them the building and the machines, and they know exactly how to do that. So that's an easy way to raise that type of finance, backed by debt, easy peasy. Because of the property of sunkenness that Stian was talking about earlier on, it's much more difficult to go to a bank and say, please can I borrow some money? I've got a great idea for an app, or I've got an idea for a new design or a piece of software or something like that. So we think in terms of policies that are going to help, in an intangible economy, going to help breed rivalry, new firms to start coming forward and challenge, the frontier firms and, be the next frontier firms of tomorrow. Part of that policy, I think, has got to be around reforming finance, and making it easier for companies to raise that type of money and not having preferential tax treatment, for example, around debt, and maybe having a different kind of vision about what a financial system looks like. So I think that's part of the answer. And then the other part of the answer is the sort of public policy side on science policy. Do you want to say a word about science policy?
Shall I say a bit? So there seems to be evidence that public investment in at least some intangibles, so particularly R&D, which is relatively well measured, is associated with increased private investment. So there isn't a crowding out effect. On the contrary, there's a crowding in effect. So there's kind of one simple answer that public subsidies for R&D, one way or another, are a good thing. You mentioned R&D tax credits. I think there's a kind of ferocious debate that I see among economists and policymakers about whether it's better to subsidize R&D through R&D tax credits or through direct funding of R&D, whether on the part of businesses or universities. And certainly in my day job, that's a very lively debate, and I don't feel I've heard a convincing answer for the trade-off between them. But I think, one of the things that is kind of interesting is how you might do public subsidy of other intangibles. So if you go to Paris, for example, the city of Paris has an app called My Taxi, or maybe it's called Me Taxi, I don't know, but that's how it's spelt. And that's basically a publicly owned Uber. So that's a public investment, not just in software, but in building the network of drivers, and they believe that for various public policy reasons, that's a really valuable thing to have in public ownership. It's kind of an interesting experiment. It would be interesting to see whether there's a belief that we should have more public platforms like that. Certainly the public sector has for a long time produced data, and the US Census Bureau is a great example of that role. But it may be that there's a greater interest in having the public provision and ownership of various data sets rather than having it all owned by Google or other people like that. But I think from a public policy point of view, we're really feeling our way here. It took decades to work out how to even tolerably fund, say, academic science and academic research. That took a very long time to build those effective systems. So building systems to invest in other types of R&D will take a while too. But the big picture of saying there should be more public investment in intangibles, I think that could be quite a big change in the coming years and decades.
Is there anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question of our authors? Let's see, we'll start right here. I saw that hand first. Do we have a microphone? We do. All right.
I probably need that, but I'll use it anyway. Oh, sure. Thanks for coming. My name's Kevin McNamee. I'm a first-year full-time MBA student. I have one question and then a short, somewhat funny comment, I hope. So given that we're talking about Uber a lot, how does the low substitution costs of consumers' use of these intangible products put pressure on corporate governance of a firm, using Uber as a pretty good example? My comment is just that Doctor Who is a pretty good British innovation as well. So that's all. Thank you.
The other innovation, a slightly older innovation, of course, is Monty Python. That's the other great British innovation, which everybody has heard of as well, a deeply intangible innovation as well. So the question was how the corporate governance of Uber, sorry.
Yeah, so the low switching costs of consumers to be able to put pressure on the corporate governance of a particular company. Speaking of the former CEO of Uber in particular, the move to Lyft, doesn't that lead to the possibility of hollowing out a company based on one or two bad actors in that company?
I suppose it does, and I suppose it also reflects, again, on an intangibles kind of line, the extent to which, many of these companies, the reputation is just a really key part, of the company. Uber doesn't have any taxi cabs, any tangible assets it could go off and sell and all that kind of thing. Well, right, exactly. What has it got? It's got a fantastic app, obviously, and which, as we were discussing earlier on, can be scaled. But the reputation effect seems to be very important as well. And so, maybe increasingly what we're going to find is that companies are really quite vulnerable to, malfeasance, if that's the right word, of the CEO or socially unacceptable behavior of the senior employees. For precisely because, reputation as their intangible asset is going to be so key.
So I think this is a huge riddle about kind of modern capitalism and technology. Because if we think about, the interests of capital, the interests of labor, and the interests of consumers as kind of three groups, humanity is now in possession of this kind of suite of technologies, social media, social ICT technologies, which ought to be kind of an amazing gift for mobilizing labor to represent its interests or mobilizing consumers to represent their interests. But actually, if we see who's largely benefited from these so far, from sort of sharing economy technologies, it's largely capital. It's things like TaskRabbit, it's things like Uber, which kind of mobilize labor, but very much kind of on the terms of capital. And I think it's kind of, if I were sort of someone senior in, say, the trade union movement or in the consumer rights movement, I would definitely be asking what would need to happen for these technologies, which seem very consumer-friendly or very labor-friendly, to act in those interests. But I think it's a really interesting question you pose.
Just exercise moderator's prerogative real quick. Yeah. Uber doesn't just have the app. It also has a lot of extremely valuable data. And how does big data fit into this sort of framework that you set up here?
Oh, I think I'm going to chip in with a very boring national income accounting observation, if I may, which is I mentioned earlier on that software was one of these key assets. Actually, it's software and data is one of these key assets. So the national income accountants, and this is a really hard task, are supposed to value the investments that firms are making in data and as say, it's put under the heading of software, and that would blow up GDP in that sense. So if you're busy investing in data and finding out new things and all of that, that's, again, like making an investment, but this time in an intangible asset. That turns out, we document this a little bit in the book, quite varying practice around OECD countries. The OECD have done some work on this, as to the extent to which it is and is not counted. So I think it's one of those assets which are mostly hidden. It should be in there, but it's mostly hidden, and it's probably getting a wider and wider gap. The fact that it's omitted is probably causing a wider and wider gap.
It's a great example of the synergies as well, because if you think of big data, if you've got a little bit of data, if you've got the usage patterns of one electricity customer, it's kind of useless, and that has almost no value. If you're a utility and you have the usage patterns of all the consumers in kind of a huge metro area, that kind of becomes useful. So that's kind of the ultimate intangible synergy.
And it does, can I say one more thing, actually? It does speak to this issue. We haven't mentioned, machine learning and artificial intelligence and all that. So, again, another way of thinking about machine learning and artificial intelligence is it's a sort of a confluence of very fast computers being able to process ginormous data sets using very skillfully written software. So the computers are the tangible bit in our language. The data, as we've just discussed, is the intangible bit. The software we mentioned earlier on is the intangible bit as well. So again, one way of thinking, I say, about the machine learning, artificial intelligence is it's the kind of confluence, of that group of both tangible and intangible assets.
One intangible capital to rule it all.
Correct.
Let's see. How about you, Mike?
So let me go to the question of Amazon.
We've got a mic for you, Mike.
Okay. Let me go to the question of Amazon. So Amazon has 40,000 employees in Seattle and 180,000 employees across the rest of the U.S. They've invested an enormous amount of money in e-commerce fulfillment centers, buildings, tangible capital. Okay, they've hired a lot of workers, and what they use their fulfillment centers to move around physical things, and it's not aggregated. It's spread out into places that are not cities. Most of these fulfillment centers are sitting kind of in the middle of nowhere because the land is cheap. And so the question that I want you to address is whether or not there may be two trends going on, okay, that sort of fit into your larger framework. One trend is towards the agglomeration, and then perhaps there's another trend where you actually use the intangibles to maybe spread things out, to make distance distribution cheaper, make transportation cheaper, and so that some of what we may be seeing is maybe the early stages of capitalism without capital, and then the next stage may actually look somewhat different. So I want you to kind of address that.
So I think that's a really interesting question. Obviously, one of the big questions, or one of the big issues about agglomeration, is that 20 years ago there were lots of interesting books along the lines of the death of distance, and distance would soon be kind of abolished by ICT. And distance has kind of stubbornly refused to die, and in some ways because we haven't come up with ways of bridging those distances, for the most part, as we've said, kind of the value of being in these dynamic cities has increased. But I think you're absolutely right that just because distance hasn't died so far doesn't mean that it might not be kind of on the way out at some point. And it will be these kind of information communication technologies and some of these intangible investments that causes it to go away. I guess the question is we just don't know when, and until it happens, it's kind of the opposite. This distance will be a really, really big problem until suddenly it's not. I think when that change happens, should I say if? I think I'm like you. I believe that it probably will happen, but I kind of can't put my finger on when. I think when that change happens, things will radically change again. I mean, what I would take away from that, from a normative point of view, is that in the same way that DARPA and others put lots of investment in the 1960s into kind of developing video conferencing and developing ARPANET and some of these kind of early distance killing technologies, I think that would be an extremely valuable field for public investment now, because the benefits of doing that are just so high.
go right here, and then we'll work our way across.
I'm Mike Nelson. I do public policy for Cloudflare, which is a web security firm. But I've also been an adjunct faculty member here at Georgetown in the Communications, Culture, and Technology program. But I'm actually asking you a question because 25 years ago, I was in the Clinton White House, one of the 2 people doing internet policy. And even back then, we were talking about intangibles, one of the 4 big issues that caused us the big headaches, along with porn, cybersecurity, and privacy, was copyright. I just did what my worst students did. They usually read the table of contents, scan the index, and they look at the one chapter that really is pertinent to them, which was chapter 10 on public policy. When I was at the White House, for fun, we would get an economist from the Department of Justice Antitrust Division and a lawyer from the Patent and Trademark Office and ask them what the best copyright policy should be. And they saw the world so totally different. So my question is, what is the right copyright policy? And what is the economist? The economist would say, look, all the economists say that the ideal term of copyright is 6 to 14 years. The Patent and Trademark Office would say, Disney pays our bills. The ideal copyright term is forever minus 1 day. The other problem that the 2 of them would argue about was whether copyright was leading to more concentration by eliminating competition. You grant somebody a monopoly license, that inevitably means less competition. So, in 3 words or less, or 3 minutes or less, what's the ideal copyright policy? I noticed you only spent 3 pages on copyright in the index. So.
Do you want to?
No, you go ahead. You're in the hot seat.
So yeah, so one of the aspects of my day job is the minister I advise is the intellectual property minister in the UK. So this is definitely something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. I think you're absolutely right. There is a huge conflict here, and there's kind of very divergent interests between rights holders on the one hand, platforms on the other hand, people who are looking out for consumer interests. What we say in the book is that there's a significant benefit to achieving clarity. And we make the point that laws over tangible property and who owns tangible property are literally as old as human law itself. The first human law code from ancient Sumeria describes tangible property in quite a lot of detail. The first laws on intangible assets are about 3,000 years later. So human beings have just had less time to work out not just what it means legally to own intangibles, but even what it means kind of culturally, what is legitimate. And so there is more contestability in this space. I think, so we go as far as to say, it is good to get more certainty in this area. And what certainty means will probably depend from country to country based on what is democratically sustainable in that place. I know there's certainly one of the things we wrestle with in copyright in the UK a lot is the question of the value gap. How do we decide how to make sure that people who are investing in producing content can make some kind of fair return that justifies them continuing to produce it, while at the same time not compromising consumer interests or limiting innovation. And we get into hard questions. We get into hard questions which you'll be really familiar with around safe harbor on the internet. Does that lead to adverse outcomes for rights holders? But equally, as you say, if you kind of let rights holders write the rules, then you will have ever-extending copyright terms which equally aren't necessarily in consumer interests or even artist interests. So I guess what I'm saying, this is really hard. The kind of the day-by-day work of getting close to understanding, which often just seems, in my experience, is getting people in a room again and again and having debates with them until we can get more agreement, it's the kind of staff work that you need to do. I struggle to find a kind of clear outcome, though, that I would say, here is obviously the right answer. Sorry if that's kind of wishy-washy.
Your next book, perhaps.
So we're going to go here for a very succinct question.
I'm Alex. I'm an exchange student from the UK, from the University of Sussex. Related to artistic content and how it relates to public ownership, as an intangible. Do you think it's been a beneficial experience for, especially given all the controversy surrounding the BBC lately, to have artistic content in public hands? Or should we be looking to pass that on so it can expand further and ideally develop, you could argue America has a slightly more broad artistic content base?
So, well, I mean, I think it's interesting. The BBC is kind of clearly an example of the public production of intangibles, and a bunch of things that the BBC did. For example, in the 1990s, the BBC was kind of very ahead of its time in developing internet content, and there's a lot of things in the kind of the UK internet sector now that can be traced back to investment that the BBC made in kind of early web design in the 1990s. I think one of the things that is really important, though, if you view these, I don't think anyone at the BBC would view what they do as creating public intangibles. If you told them that, they'd kind of scratch their heads and sort of ask what you were playing at. But if you do think of that as the justification for spending taxpayers' money on creating this kind of thing, then it does raise the question, how do you maximize the synergies and how do you maximize the crowding in effect of other people investing? And I think some of the things that the BBC has been trying to do recently, whether that's commissioning more external content or making sure that they are being complementary to private investment rather than crowding it out, I think is kind of probably steps in the right direction.
The gentleman in the glasses.
I'd like to follow up on the copyright question and extend that to other issues of intellectual property. A few years ago, at least in the U.S., we moved from first to invent to first to file, which has benefited either incumbents or at least the first movers. And similarly, we have issues with increased use of anti-compete clauses. So I'm wondering if IP reform might be the deregulation or the trust busting of the 21st century.
So shall I just try and chip in? So again, we talk in the book a lot about having clarity. What we don't want is we don't want a lot of kind of shopping around, by the litigants to try to find the friendliest court or the friendliest, international jurisdiction who rule in favour of them. That seems to be, extremely socially wasteful. I think the other issue that we talk about, and we, draw on work that others like Bronwyn Hall have done, is that, patenting policy in pharmaceuticals looks different to patenting policy in many other industries like smartphones. So in smartphones, if I want to build another smartphone, I need about 120 other patents to cope with. And so it's just very expensive for me to negotiate my way through the 120 other owners. And so there you probably want to be very careful about having a tight patenting policy, because although you have the incentives for the first person to invent, the follow-on invention is extremely difficult. Whereas in pharmaceuticals, that's less the case because there's less kind of common sharing of all of that. So it may be, again, maybe this is a rather wishy-washy answer, it may be that these types of policies are quite sectorally dependent, in particular on, as I say, the nature of interlocking patents and whether follow-up innovation requires lots or little of these things.
Just one quick thing. I think a really smart public policy move, to the extent that certainty and clear rules are a good thing in these kind of economies. They encourage more investment. One thing that argues for is you shouldn't underfund regulators or patent offices. So I realize I'm coming to Washington saying we should spend more money on bureaucrats. It's a kind of an easy message for the home crowd, but I think that's a kind of quick win for public policy.
Let's go right here in front. Very quickly.
So my question is on secular stagnation. Do you think it's secular stagnation because we're not properly measuring all the benefits that we've had, right? Netflix, they don't have to go to Blockbuster anymore. All they own is, they don't own the pipes, all they own is the content that they didn't deliver to my house. They don't even do it in DVD anymore. Or do you think it's secular stagnation because we've kind of hit all our low-hanging fruit in terms of actual physical capital, and the only gains are in the intangible assets that you're talking about?
So let me try that. I mean, that's a terrific question, and we try and unpack that a little bit in the book, but it's kind of complicated. So, without trying to spend too much time, maybe trying to walk through it a little bit. So, there is a bit of mismeasurement going on in the sense that, as I was trying to say before, even despite the best efforts of the national income accountants in this room, we're not measuring all the investment that we should measure, and GDP is less than it was. That turns out, at least according to our calculations and the types of work we've tried to do, to be a rather small aspect of it, actually. So that it's not all of it. Now, in your question, there's a slightly separate question around the kind of the boundaries of GDP. If we're consuming a lot of these intangible assets, we're reading Wikipedia and consuming all of this stuff at home and writing apps in our spare time, that's not in GDP at all. So there's a much broader question, which again other people in this room are working on, about whether we've got the right boundaries correct. But leaving that slightly aside, so we think it is a real thing, the secular stagnation. So what might be causing it? So a couple of things might be causing it. One is that, of course, one of the properties of intangibles is spillovers. So if I come up with some good design for an iPhone, that benefits you if you're a design manufacturer. So that means if there's a bit of a slowdown in intangible investment, which there was after the Great Recession, especially in Europe and especially in Scandinavian countries, that means that I'm spending less on R&D, but that hurts you as well. So the whole economy slows down. It kind of punches above its weight. And economists call this kind of multi-factor productivity because of these various spillovers. So that's one aspect of it. And then the second aspect of it, sorry, this is kind of a long answer, but I'll stop at the second aspect, is again the leaders and laggards effect that we're talking about, that if you've got these kind of dynamic leaders who are busy, zooming off, but these laggards who are kind of falling behind, then the kind of the averaging process might pull the overall average down, if you see what I mean, if there's enough weight, as it were, of the laggards for doing this. We haven't quite nailed all that down, but we think that might be a possibility as well, which has an effect on overall secular stagnation.
We're going to take one more. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question, but my understanding is that we're going to be able to do some informal Q&A after the official event is over. So you've been waiting very patiently.
Thank you all. This will be a pretty quick question. So currently I'm a second-year MBA here at Georgetown MSP, but pre-business school I was an urban geographer. I'm very familiar with your concepts of agglomeration, and I'm very happy to hear you mention them. People have been trying to wrestle with this for a while. A very interesting example, I think, is Liverpool, Manchester, your high-speed rail 3, and a number of the initiatives the UK has tried to undertake to try and deal with this. I was wondering if you had been able to look at that at all, and if you felt that there were any lessons learned as that has come to shape.
Shall I say a quick thing then, Steve? So I think, funnily enough, I think we feel we've learned a lot from some of the people who studied this issue here in Washington, actually, Bruce Katz and people like that, here in DC. And, gosh, this is going to go back to the copyright question. It's just really hard, this placemaking issue. And I think it's hard partly for quite a good reason. I mean, as you know, these agglomeration externalities come in many different mixes. Some are sort of quite Marshallian, named after the British economist, hooray, Alfred Marshall, who thought that the thing is that there's lots of spillovers and agglomeration externalities within an industry. So a town like Sheffield, for example, had lots of steel. It just did steel. Other people did steel. Everybody benefited from the fact that there was lots of steel going on. That's one type of agglomeration. And the other type of agglomeration is named after, June Jacobs, who famously, documented these types of things in New York, that these things come from diversity, actually, that what you want is you want things across different industries. Textile industry is going to learn from the steel industry, is going to learn from the fashion industry and all that kind of thing. So I think one of the reasons why the placemaking issue is so very hard is we don't quite know which of these agglomeration effects is driving it. I think the other thing, one more thing, and then maybe Steve wants to come in, is that in Britain, the other example that we hear is about Stanford University, which, as I understand it, was built 100-odd years ago, and there was kind of nothing around there at the time. But listen, 100 years later, what have we got? We've got one of the most amazing kind of geographical agglomerations that we could see. So maybe in the UK, if we wait for 100 years' time, build a university somewhere, wait for 100 years' time, maybe good things might happen.
Stian, you have...
I think just the specific UK example you mentioned of Liverpool and Manchester. The UK is a very strange place from an economic geography point of view, because I would argue that it's probably the most centralized rich country from a kind of political economy point of view. Maybe China is historically more centralized, but beyond that, it's kind of remarkably centralized. So I think in some ways, although there have been efforts to try and increase investment in places like Liverpool and Manchester, the bulk of investment, particularly in things like public intangibles, still goes to the kind of the southeast of the country. So I think this is kind of a work in progress rather than something where, you know, we haven't seen the results because there's a problem. I think we haven't seen the results because we haven't really tried yet.
Thank you all so much for coming. I hope you'll stick around for a little bit. And yes, please give our authors a hand.